For our next session, you're going to hear from the Henry Samueli School of Engineering professor, David Kisailus. David, you have the floor.
Okay, very good. And you can see me. Let's see if you can see my slides. You can see, yeah? Just to be sure.
Yep, you're good. We can see your slides and we can hear you.
Great, well, wonderful, and welcome everyone. And I'm David Kisailus. Actually, I'm a transplant to UC Irvine from UC Riverside right at the start of the pandemic. Perfect timing, but a beautiful place to come to UC Irvine, so I'm happy to be here. And I'll talk a little bit about what my students do, both undergraduate students, graduate students, postdocs here at UC Irvine related to biology and how we can learn from biological systems that have evolved over hundreds of millions of years to design really extravagant types of materials that we can then extract those blueprints, take them and utilize them for next generation materials. And I'm a professor, by the way, in the Department of Material Science and Engineering here at UCI. This is part of the team. We have, again, postdoctoral researchers from all over the world, graduate students, undergraduate students who are spectacular in fields not only including material science and engineering, but molecular biology, chemical, mechanical, aerospace engineering, and organic chemistry. So we're a pretty diverse group, both in location and what our majors were or are. So in my lab, you might think we're a little bit strange, but we ask some interesting questions. We ask questions like, can we actually learn from, I'm going to remove this link. I can't even see my slides. Sorry, let me go back because I'm trying to remove the button up top here. How do I get out of that? Can I remove the top bar? I can't see the titles to my slides for some reason. Anyway, I'll just go on. So we study organisms. And this one, for example, can we learn about sponges that are actually found in the deep ocean about making fracture-resistant materials? Can we learn from mollusks, different types of snails, including one that I have right here, for example, about making next-generation LEDs and lasers? Can we actually learn from other types of, again, marine organisms like these chitin here in the upper left, or this giant squid, this Humboldt squid that's as tall as me, 6 feet tall, about making wear-resistant, abrasion-resistant gears? Now, why can't she be happy? So that's a complex question, but if you look at her carbon fiber bicycle and her broken arm, she may be more upset at the carbon fiber bicycle fracture than her own arm because of the cost to her. So can we make her more happy? So my laboratory here at UC Irvine actually focuses really on two main thrusts. We look at organisms that are what I would call an extremophile. They do things either mechanically or thermally or optically very interesting. And we try to reverse engineer it. We try to understand how they're architected from the nanoscale all the way up to the macro scale. What are the materials found in these organisms and how do they work? And once we know that, can we actually use engineered materials, carbon fiber, glass fiber, advanced materials not found in nature, to translate this using a process called biomimetics or biomimicry to make next generation materials? The other half of my lab says, hey, why don't we understand also how these organisms form? I mean, you yourself, you have bone that is actually a composite structure of mineral, calcium phosphate, and protein, collagen, that is self-assembled and you form these crystals to make your bone. We understand, or we look to understand, those processes in organisms. And then by understanding that process, we say, could we use the same strategy, what I call bio-inspired processing, for making nanomaterials? So the upper right here is actually the inner lining of that shell that I just showed a minute ago, made of chalk. But look at the precision at which biology can synthesize those nanoplatelets of crystals inside that shell. Can we use that strategy to make next generation battery materials that can charge much faster and hold their charge for a much longer time? So these are really the two halves to my group. And I'm just going to give a couple examples of what we do just because we have limited time. But I will say, if anyone is interested in learning more, and I'm always trying to recruit great undergrads and grad students, let your friends know. We're always happy. And if you want to see our lab, let me know by email. Okay, so nature. It's evolved over hundreds of millions of years. And I'm actually currently directing an $8 million center on advanced materials that are strong, tough, they can absorb energy, they're stiff, but they're also lightweight. And we're trying to understand these organisms' design, again, to translate into something like this carbon fiber composite that's really thin, lightweight, but very tough and energy absorbent. But nature, of course, beyond just designing their materials that have these different components, go one step further. They have multifunctionality, just like you do. You're able to self-heal. If you break your bone, you can self-heal. They can actually have some adaptation. They can sense, and I mentioned self-repair already. So they have multifunctionality. Could we actually implement that into, let's say, this structural material, this composite carbon fiber that you'd find in an aircraft or an automobile, to make the structure the actual battery of the car? So if you drive a Tesla, instead of having those heavy batteries in your car, the trunk deck or the roof of your car becomes the battery. So this is kind of where the direction we're going with my research. Now, we study these organisms that are incredibly impact resistant. This is an alligator gar, a very tough scaled fish in the southeast United States. These are bighorn sheep that under mating season, they're colliding with each other, but their horns don't contain mineral. They're only made of keratin. It's very tough. It's the architecture inside those horns that makes them tough. Watch the eyeball on this woodpecker. It has to close its eye because it's decelerating so fast when it's pecking, its eyeball may pop out of its head. So we understand what the structure is from its beak through its skull that makes it able to impact while it's pecking so many times without fracturing or damaging its own brain. And then the last one in the lower right is something that we actually have in our laboratory. These are called mantis shrimp. They're little crustaceans about 4 inches long that use these arms to smash their prey, and they can smash thousands of times without breaking. And I'll talk more about that as I go through. So we study these organisms and we really look for design features in all of those organisms that we can utilize for automobiles, aircraft. We have now a project with California Energy Commission on wind energy blades that are stronger and tougher, but it all starts with nature. So we study these organisms, and again, I'm going to highlight this critter here, this mantis shrimp, and it looks like, it's not a shrimp, it's a crustacean. It looks like it has the body plan of a shrimp, and from the front, it looks like a praying mantis. But it uses these clubs, these arms, these called thoracic appendages called dactyl clubs, to, again, smash its prey underwater thousands of times without breaking its own fist. And it can do this accelerating underwater faster than a 22 caliber bullet underwater. So this is incredibly fast speed strikes underwater that this organism can generate so much power and impact its prey. And it impacts, they're only 4 inches long, but it can impact with up to about 300 pounds of force onto its prey. And we've measured, well, a collaborator of mine has actually measured how much force was impacted. But notice after this first impact, 300 pounds of force from the first strike, there's a second type of impact here. It's not actually from the contact of the club to the prey. It's actually because the mantis is going so fast underwater, it's shearing the water and boiling the water. It's actually creating what we call cavitation. So actually in marine ships, submarines, just regular ships, when the impeller is moving underwater to push the ship forward, there's a lot of damage eventually that occurs because of this cavitation problem. But again, the mantis shrimp can do this thousands of times without damaging its own club. So the obvious question for us in our lab is, what is it made of? How is it architected? And can we utilize those designs? So this is just a little bit about what we do in the laboratory. Again, we reverse engineer by using a series of microscopy techniques, scanning electron microscopy. Here it's CT scans and spectroscopy to really understand, again, its architecture as well as its material components. And you can see this body plan here of the mantis shrimp. This is its eye, actually. This is part of its body. Here's the top. This is the actual mantis shrimp's dactyl club here. And you can see the club itself, it's very heavily mineralized with some type of mineral. In fact, it's a calcium phosphate mineral, exactly the same mineral found in your bone, hydroxyapatite. And what we do is we'll take that club and we will section the club and we'll determine what does it look like. So this is actually a cross section of its fist. And it's used under a special scanning electron microscope in a special mode where the lighter color or the lighter contrast here means there are heavy elements inside. So this is the calcium phosphate. And then you see this kind of layered region underneath. Well, there's actually many regions within this club. First, we call this very heavily mineralized region the impact region, the surface that's going to strike the poor organism that it wants to eat. But the periodic region in red here is really something that we investigated because we found a very interesting architecture that actually other organisms that are not even related to the mantis shrimp have evolved a design. So it's called a convergent design feature. So we found inside this periodic region a very interesting architecture. And when we were looking at this cross section, we noticed cracks. And the cracks didn't follow a straight line. They have these kind of C-shaped curved cracks. And we were wondering, what happens to those cracks? This organism is just pounding and pounding away at its prey, and it's developing cracks. But the cracks all stay inside the club. They actually don't propagate out of the club, and the club does not fracture. It holds intact. But when we actually, instead of using a polished section of this club, we actually said, let's fracture open the club to see what it looks like. And it looks like this. So on the right side is a structure called a Bouligand or helicoid structure. Actually, I have a little model that my student made just using actually popsicle sticks. But you essentially have unidirectional fibers that are stacked on top of each other. You can see in this yellow model on the right, but each subsequent layer, they're rotated a small angle. So it's like a twisted plywood type of structure. The fibers in this organism are just made of a complex sugar called chitin, and the mineral surrounding the fibers, again, is that calcium phosphate, similar mineral that's found in your bone. So it's a composite structure, but it has this architecture, this helicoid architecture. And it's this architecture that actually provides a lot of energy absorption to the organism. So we determined using some modeling as well as some 3D printing to try to validate what's happening inside that club every time it's impacting. And we found that the design feature, this Bouligand or helicoid structure, combined with this fiber-like material surrounded by a glue, if you will, a matrix material, will deflect cracks and twist cracks. And so any little crack that may form during a hard impact will actually have a really hard time to propagate. Unlike, for example, if I have a glass here, my dirty tea glass, if I drop it on the floor, crack will just rip right through and this ceramic will shatter. Conversely, this structure will not shatter. It will absorb all of that energy during these impacts. So that's a very critical thing that we uncovered way back in 2012. We published this in journal Science. Since then, we've actually done a lot with the helicoid. And so what do we do with the helicoid? So the biomimetic part says, we know now that this design is really tough and really strong. Why don't we take, instead of the biological materials, and take carbon fiber instead of the polysaccharide fiber? And instead of the calcium phosphate glue, let's use a resin that you would find, again, your Boeing 787 is made of 50% carbon fiber composite. Some of advanced vehicles right now are also made of carbon fiber composite. Let's mimic this architecture, but using carbon fiber. And now we have projects and a startup company making aerospace parts, automotive parts, wind energy blades that can last a lot longer and absorb a lot more energy than the current designs. So this is how we proved that. We actually took carbon fiber, unidirectional, again, just like this little model I have here, but each layer that I show with 0, 12, 24, 36 there is a layer of unidirectional carbon fiber that's stacked on top of each other, mimicking this mantis shrimp. And then we made another carbon fiber composite using the design that Boeing uses in its 787. And this is a little bit different design where fibers are stacked 0, 45, minus 45, 90 each time on top of one another. And what we did was we took carbon fiber, those composites that we made, and we put it here. It's about a 4 or 5 millimeter thick panel, put it in this little device, and this hammer is going to drop down on top. So we lock in the panel. This hammer, it's called the drop tower, comes down and it impacts the panel. And it's kind of mimicking what, let's say an aircraft, a bird strike, a hail strike, things like this that might occur to an aircraft automobile. It mimics that to see how much damage occurs to these panels. And when we compared what's called the dense depth, how much damage occurred to the panel, which is kind of on this y-axis here, this dent depth, this design from the Boeing 787 called quasi-isotropic had significantly more damage than that from our mantis shrimp mimics. We made 3 mimics, a small angle rotation, a medium angle, and a large angle, but all 3 showed significant reduction in damage, which means that we could actually take the same material, reduce the thickness, for example, with this medium angle, reduce it by half, which means half the weight, half the fuel used, but have the same type of strength and toughness. So this is very important. And of course, once we published this, actually Boeing's competitor contacted me, Airbus, to work on a project together. And so this is the direction we're going. So we're now taking designs from this helicoid. We're making helmets. This is my former student, Jesus. He's now at Lawrence Livermore National Lab doing a postdoc. He's a grad student at University of California. So he made a helmet. And so I'd like somebody to build me a Bugatti because I can't afford one. But anyway, so if somebody wants to join and help build a Bugatti, that'd be great. But we're also looking to making aircraft and also sporting good type of equipment. So this is actually spun off as a startup company from University of California technology that we, meaning my students and me, invented in the lab. And now this company, Helicoid Industries, is making hockey sticks and automotive parts, armors, things like this, aerospace, and wind energy blades. That project is going very well, where we're showing that by having this design, the wind energy blades, which cost $500,000 each, could last much longer and therefore save a lot of money. So what else are we doing? I'm just going to kind of highlight a few things. The mantis shrimp was kind of it's a nice story, but there's so many other things we're doing. We're actually studying a beetle. We just published this last year in the journal Nature. This is called the diabolical ironclad beetle. You could drive over this beetle with a car. It does not die. We've tried it. And we've compared to other organisms, other beetles, I should say. They didn't fare so well. But the architecture is critical. So now, again, we're making some aircraft parts that actually where, for example, in that Boeing 787, you can't have all composite. There has to be some metal, at least currently. How do you join them together? We're now making joints that show the same strength, but higher toughness than the current aircraft standard. And by the way, this beetle, which actually happens to be up in Riverside, California, where it's super hot in the summers, can self-cool. Can we make self-cooling structures now? This is another project we're working on. This one's called the chitin. This one eats rock. It eats rock to get to algae. The algae is growing on the rock and inside the rock. And it has a specialized set of teeth here that you can see. This is its mouth that scratch along the rock. And then, of course, it wears away the rock to get to the algae. Its teeth are actually magnetic. It's pretty amazing. But the magnetism it's not the magnetism that's its function. It's the magnetite, the material that is magnetic, that's really hard, that can scratch away the rocks. So we're trying to make next generation wear-resistant materials from this. And then this is a really quite an appropriate one for California. This is a fire-resistant plant that requires fire to actually propagate its species. So fire burns. It's actually found in Australia, of course. Fire burns. These pods that protect the seeds here on the right in red actually have to survive against really intense fires in the bush, 600, 700 degrees centigrade. We took it in the lab at 1,100 and it survived for a pretty long time. Can we understand the designs from this plant to make fire-resistant fabrics and building panels? I mean, California is always on fire. So this is something we'd like to do. So the last part is talking about the nano side of my lab. And again, biology, including yourselves, can make really high, specifically crystalline structured materials with incredible precision at room temperature. So could we actually use bio-inspiration for making low temperature processed materials that are more environmentally friendly? Can we control how those structures actually grow? And of course, when we control those structures, we can optimize its function. And I'll give you an example. And the idea here, of course, is to avoid any high temperature environmentally unfriendly methods. So this is just a good example of what biology can do. That shell that I talked about earlier, it's made of a crystal called aragonite, which is calcium carbonate, chalk. But look at its architecture compared to what you'd find in geology, these needle-like structures. Biology can control the shape and size of these crystals very precisely. So could we use this strategy for making materials for fuel cells? I actually have a project with a Swiss company making fuel cells that are less than 1% the cost of some of the catalysts that are currently used and are equally effective. Can we make batteries that are effective? Can we make water purifying membranes for clean drinking water? So can we charge our car in 5 minutes? Well, we're trying to do that by making nanomaterials that are bio-inspired by controlling the size and shape of these nanomaterials during their growth, again, inspired by biology to charge very quickly. Why can't we have drinking water that's clean? This is a big problem around the world. Wars were fought over oil for the last century. Wars will be and are being fought for water rights. This is just an example. When you take ibuprofen, if you have a headache, when your body ingests this, you process about 50% of that and you excrete the rest out, flush the toilet, and it goes to a wastewater treatment plant where you hope that it will then scavenge and not allow that ibuprofen to continue back into drinking water. It's a good time for me to take a drink. But in fact, it does. And some of these compounds are being found. These are birth control drugs here that are now being found in drinking water. So those are very dangerous for the human body. Could we develop systems that can be utilized in water purification plants where we can actually take advantage of this nanostructural control? Here we're making hollow nanospheres of a material called tantalum nitride that actually absorbs visible light from the sun and creates these things called radicals. These radicals can actually destroy any organic compound, viruses, bacteria, and harmful chemicals. Can we then take these nanoparticles here, put them into a slurry, and 3D print membranes that we can now use to pass dirty water through a membrane, shine light on it, and out will come clean water? It's another project we have in our laboratory. And so again, not only are we trying to implement these nanomaterials, we're actually trying to utilize biodegradable polymers instead of synthetic polymers so that at the end of life, that these polymers will just go back into the ground and not sit in an ocean for 1,000 years and end up as microplastics and nanoplastics in our drinking water. So that's it. I could talk for days on this. The people. Now, again, I have some slides from UC Riverside. Forgive me, but I came here right before the pandemic, but we hope to continue something similar. My graduate students mentor undergrad teams. The undergrads, they go out to middle schools. And what they do is they talk to 5th and 6th graders about bio-inspired biomimicry, and they have a project together and they form little teams. And what they do is the undergrad will train the middle school student about the science, and it will culminate in a museum event here that we held in Riverside before. We've done it for 10 years now, up until the pandemic, where the undergrad student will present the science with this poster, but the middle school student will be next to them, and the middle school student will develop a demo, just like my model here, if you will, to explain the science to folks that aren't in the science field. So I really think this is a great way to kind of go towards our community. And then we just, on that crush-resistant beetle, this is actually something that ended up in Ranger Rick. For those of you that know this science magazine, we published a paper on that beetle, and it ended up getting in Ranger Rick as well. So hopefully our youth can see what we can do based on bio-inspiration. And then, of course, just my own team members. We work hard, we try and play hard too. And of course, we not only thank all the students, but we thank the organisms here because they sacrifice quite a bit to help have this research happen. So with that, I'm open to any questions. Thank you.
David, you have one question in Q&A if you want to take that one.
Oh, sure. Is the helix design that you showed similar to that of our human DNA? Oh, that's very interesting. Not quite. The human DNA is more of in fact, it's a helix. This is a helicoid in that you would have a layer, for example, here, of single directional fibers. But then you could take this layer and stack it on top of another layer. So it's a different design than the human DNA. Then it rotates around in a spiral. So in a way, it does look like a helix, but the structure is called a helicoid.
Okay, well, Professor Kisailus, that was extremely enlightening and very fun. What amazing research you're doing, and thank you for sharing that with the alumni audience. We really appreciate it. Thanks for the program.
Oh, no problem at all. It's a pleasure.